Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. We thank you all for listening to Intimate Judaism, and we appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. Because of the sensitive topics that Talli and I discuss, we need your help to let people know about the podcast. So thank you all for sharing, and please continue to do so. Please also visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. And please continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com.
Scott, we've been getting many letters of appreciation from people who have really encouraged us to continue with our program because we are talking about things that are not generally spoken about. Today's episode is a good example of that. We've been talking about premarital sex and sexual education and many other topics, not really out there in the conversation publicly. And I think one of them that we really need to address is one that does affect many, many marriages, and that's the topic of marital fidelity and infidelity.
And I know you told me before we began, we were discussing what we're going to talk about. You're referring to much more than simply having an affair in the classic sense where there's sexual intercourse between unmarried partners when one of them is married. We're talking about something much broader than that in addition to that.
Yeah, it's interesting when it comes to extramarital behaviors and dealing with them, at least in a therapeutic setting, which is the setting that I work in. The actual issue of intercourse doesn't seem to be quite as important as the issue of the affair itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there are many different types of infidelities. I think that we can start out just by acknowledging that this is why it's good that we're speaking, you a rabbi and me a therapist, because there is a halachic issue, and that is one that is important for you to address, but there's also an issue of breach of trust. It's a rift that is caused in a marriage which needs to be understood, it needs to be addressed, it needs to be processed, and there are many, many stages to that process. And part of it is understanding what this affair was about. There are many different types of affairs, and there's a great spectrum of what would be considered a betrayal. And some of that, by the way, is pretty subjective. Some behaviors that couples allow in one another with members of the opposite sex would be considered a betrayal if it were to occur with other couples. So there is a subjectivity involved in what is considered to be infidelity, and there is a spectrum that can run all the way from even some women might consider finding out that her husband has been masturbating or watching pornography as a type of infidelity, and then on the other side of the spectrum, obviously having sexual relations, sometimes with a prostitute. But at the end of the day, what's interesting is that what seems to be the most hurtful in many marriages is when there is an emotional affair, sometimes when there's not even any physical touch, but that there is a strong emotional connection that can develop between two people who are married to other people.
And obviously, in a classic halachic sense, many of these other forms of infidelity you just mentioned aren't really addressed by halacha, because in halacha, the definition of infidelity in the classic sense is pretty straightforward and in some ways narrow. It refers to the wife having sexual intercourse with someone who's not her husband. That is the definition of infidelity. Technically speaking, a husband doing the same thing, while there are isurim, prohibitions involved, it wouldn't technically be infidelity, since a husband, mi'ikar hadin, in terms of classic Torah law, is allowed to have more than one wife. That has nothing to do with the fact that on the ground, one is not more a betrayal than the other. I think it would be an offensive thing to say that just because halacha acknowledges that adultery comes from the woman's side, to say, on the other hand, therefore the man having an adulterous relationship is a lower form of betrayal than the wife doing so. That's absurd.
Yes, it absolutely is. Look, I think that we've evolved. I don't know how PC that is to say, but with the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, which you can explain more about, this societal norm of men being able to take as many wives as they want and women being mikudeshet to one man has evolved.
That's certainly true. From a different perspective, we can say that the Chayrim of Rabbeinu Gershom was really more of a formalization of an idea which had already been implicit in the sources. In other words, Rabbeinu Gershom had established officially that from now on, a man can only marry one wife. Before that, legally, he could marry multiple wives. However, many, if not most people would say, even though it was technically allowed beforehand, that doesn't mean that it was accepted as a good thing. It was something which is a technical allowance, even though it was generally frowned upon. Rabbeinu Gershom was taking the implicit disapproval of that in Jewish sources and formalizing it halachically.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I recently began learning Yibamot, of all things, in my Mishnayot that I've been learning. And the one who's not the wife, the extra wives, are referred to as tsarot.
That's right,
yeah.
Which technically means troubles.
Right. So probably it wasn't considered to be an optimum situation in any event.
Right. So in that sense, it's evolved that it became formalized, but it was always there as a problem. Even in the Torah itself, we see all the way back with Avraham and his two wives, Sarah and Hagar, it was not an ideal situation. With Yaakov and his four wives, it was not an ideal situation. This is what God wanted. This is how it worked out. It was different then, but at the same time, it's not as though this was put up as an example of an ideal relationship. On some level, Yaakov wanted to have one wife, not four wives. It was a change that occurred because of circumstances, and we accept those circumstances. It's not a model, however, that we should be emulating now and wishing that we could have four wives as well.
Right, and there is more to say about this because even practically, the double standard that does exist even today is an issue. It's an issue therapeutically as well, which we can get into a little bit later. But I'd like to hear first what you have to say as a rabbi about infidelity, about the halachic aspects of it for women as well as men.
As you mentioned before, one of the most important things to mention is that there's a lot that halacha doesn't deal with in a direct way, and that therapists like yourself can add to the conversation in a way that halacha simply is not addressing. However, there are some important issues halachically. The most obvious one, apart from the isur of having an adulterous relationship, is the fact that a woman who has an adulterous relationship, and by adulterous relationship, I mean a sexual relationship, sexual intercourse, with a man who's not her husband, she is technically, in certain circumstances, I use that term advisedly, not allowed to remain with her husband. In the Gemara, Chazal term this idea, asura labal, asura laboel, that she's prohibited from being with her husband after being in an adulterous relationship, as well as with the person with whom she was having that relationship.
It's pretty punitive.
It's very punitive, and it's punitive to both the man there as well as the husband, as well as the wife. It's punitive on all aspects. The reason that I said in certain circumstances is because even though this is technically the halacha, there are numerous ways that this can be mitigated. And we're not going to go through all of them right now. I just want to give a couple of examples of how this can be mitigated. For example, there are certain situations where a woman might think that it was actually mutar. For whatever reason, she might not have realized that she was doing something which was a legal prohibition. This might sound absurd, but it really isn't when we think about people who don't know the laws of gitin. They don't know that you need to have a get. Let's say, for example, a husband and wife are legally separated, but they're not divorced, and then they reconcile. While they were separated, the woman may have had an adulterous relationship, adulterous in the sense that they were still technically married, without realizing that this was halachically forbidden. In a case like that, that's called omer mutar. She thought it was permitted. In certain circumstances, that might be considered a mitigating factor that she would not be prohibited to her husband. There are other cases such as, and this is a very interesting halachic situation actually, according to some opinions, it is true that a woman is prohibited to her husband, but only assuming there were two witnesses who saw it. Now, generally, we think of witnesses as being people who confirm that an act happened. For example, if you have a crime that occurred, if somebody murders somebody else and there are two witnesses who see it, the fact that there are two witnesses allows the court to prosecute. But without the witnesses, the crime still happened. It's just that this is the way that we clarify the reality on the ground. The crime happened regardless. There is, however, in halacha, another form of witness, which actually is a causative form of witness, meaning the witness is part of the process. The classic example would be under a chuppah. When a man gives a woman a ring and says, Harayat mikudeshet li, and there are no witnesses there, they are not married. It's not that we don't know if they're married. Without witnesses, nothing happened. The witnesses are part of the process. And according to Tosfot in Masachet Ketufot Daf Tet Amud Aleph, if there are not two witnesses who saw the woman have intercourse, which obviously is a very rare situation, how often would that happen? Then even though the crime happened, so to speak, the adulterous relationship happened, but the prohibition of going back to her husband is not in effect. It only can take place if the witnesses actually saw it. So even though the husband knows this is true, the wife knows it's true, even in Tosfos' words, if the husband himself saw it happen without witnesses there, then there is no prohibition of her going back to her husband. Now, many don't accept that opinion. However, it's important to note that it is a snifla heter. It is something that can be used in conjunction with other things in order to allow a wife to go back to her husband. A third case, and this is the last one I'll say now, though there are more, is that there are certain situations where even if the wife admits it, and even if we don't hold by this idea of Tosfot, that there need to be edim, witnesses, there are reasons we say, we don't believe you no matter what you say. There might be an ulterior motive that we apply to the wife, in which case we say, even though you said you had this adulterous relationship, perhaps you're just trying to get a divorce or something like that. That might sound anti-wife, but for our purposes, it can be a positive way of allowing them to go back together again and perhaps giving them a chance to repair their relationship. There are many more examples of cases that might change this technical punitive measure of not allowing them to be together. A very informative article appears in the book Avo Beitecha, which we mentioned in episode 9. This is a book by Rav David Stav and his son Avraham Stav. In chapter 24, it has an excellent discussion of this particular issue, which I recommend to everybody. By the way, I'll point out to our listeners that if you want to see the sources with a bit more explanation, the Rambam as well, please go to intimatejudaism.com, and in the show notes for this episode, we'll have the sources written out in full.
Thank you for all of that. I mean, I have some questions and thoughts that are coming up for me, specifically regarding what you said about going ahead and letting the relationship heal after the husband kind of doesn't accept that it happened or doesn't have to believe that it happened, etc.
Well, that's one of the ways.
Right, that's one of the ways. What I'm thinking about is a couple of the scenarios that I've dealt with where the woman has had an affair and was told by her Rav, or the husband was told by the Rav, that he should not believe her, even if she admitted it or confessed it or wanted him to know about it, or he found out about it by reading her emails or whatever it is. His approach was, listen, just don't believe that it happened. Which
as a means to allow them to stay together.
As a means to allow them to stay together, which, I understand is a halachic loophole, or one can look at even a humane way to deal with the situation. Therapeutically, there are some problems with it. This mostly has to do with the way in which we go about repairing relationships.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when an infidelity is discovered, there's definitely a need, specifically amongst Orthodox couples, to deal with this, obviously on a halachic level, and that involves a Rav or other clergy of their choosing, and should involve also a therapist. Part of the therapeutic process, there are different kind of stages to the process of dealing with an infidelity in a marriage, whether it's the woman who acted out of the marriage or whether it's the man who did so. And usually in the very beginning, there's a crisis phase. The couple is highly reactive. There's a great deal of feelings of betrayal. Often the person who did not have the affair has kind of a survival instinct. There's a lot of trying to keep together the marriage, but at the same time, there's a great deal of feelings of anger and betrayal. And the crisis phase really requires kind of a holding and kind of a damping down of the emotional reactivity, just to try to get to a place where we can process.
Well, when you say process, I assume you mean acknowledge. In other words, it goes head to head against what we just said.
Right. So part of the process is actually not only to acknowledge, but many couples come out of an affair situation with a far deeper understanding of one another. And I've seen marriages really, not that I'm, not that I'm saying to go for it, but if once it's happened.
After the fact,
the marriage can repair in a way that has allowed for some very deep understanding of one another.
I assume what you mean by that, tell me if I'm wrong, is that before the affair took place, once again, not condoning having the affair, but before the affair took place, something was already broken, which is why there was an affair. One of the two felt the need for an affair, and therefore coming back afterwards on a therapeutic level can be a means to go back and see how broken it was and trying to fix it up.
So yes and no. The truth is that for couples who kind of had a very problematic marriage to begin with, and the affair had a lot to do with the problems in the marriage. Very often, it's a way to get out of the marriage. And very often when we work on healing the affair, it doesn't really get to a much better level, but it kind of gets them to a place of forgiveness and moving on. I'm actually talking more about couples for whom the affair was not necessarily a symptom of a problem in the marriage, which, may sound like, what, really? There is such a thing? But there is. There are many, many reasons why people choose to have an affair. So on that level, understanding what were the motivations, and some of them may have had to do with the marriage, and some of them may not have had to do with the marriage, but understanding more about the person who had the affair and what led them to it is an important part of that paradigm that I spoke about, where the marriage can actually get deeper and stronger.
In that case, Talli, can you give some examples of reasons that people have an affair that are not symptoms of a broken marriage?
That are not specifically symptoms of a broken marriage. There are a lot of reasons. Sometimes people are looking for something to just help them feel alive. They may be going through a midlife crisis. They may be grieving for a death of a parent or a child. They may be looking for parts of themselves that they've not been able to play out in their current life or in their current marriage. They may be in a perfectly good marriage, but sometimes they're not feeling any kind of sexual satisfaction. Maybe they have some alternate sexual needs and desires that are not being filled in their marriage. So sometimes it's really not so much a direct result of the marriage, but something that really has to do with the person. Maybe there's some depression there, and this opportunity, this attention that this person is getting from somebody else is very healing to them in a way that they don't get when they walk into the house after a full day of work and nobody's looking at them and they're just asking when dinner's ready and, that kind of thing. Some people have some insecurity about their own sexual desirability. And if somebody gives them attention and lets them know that they're sexually desirable, that can also be something that prompts them to kind of fall into the excitement of being seen, being recognized, being noticed, and being affirmed that they're in fact desirable. Sometimes it's about expressing, acting out behaviors because of, rage or feeling controlled or that sort of thing.
Well, that sounds like problems in the marriage too.
That sounds like problems in the marriage, absolutely. That could be, and it's not binary. It's not either or. That's the thing. That's why it's so important. The first thing that we want to do is understand that not in all cases did the partner act out in order to hurt the spouse. And that's very important because the spouse who was betrayed is going to feel very, very injured. And of course, they would be very injured because it's a very deep injury and it's a betrayal. So that makes sense that the partner would feel betrayed and feel injured. But here's a way to look at it a little bit differently. If we can give an example like masturbation, okay? So you have a couple that comes in and the wife says, I'm so hurt. I'm so hurt and so betrayed that my husband could masturbate. How could he do this to me? And when you hear that, you might be able to help the partner see that, well, in fact, he masturbated, but that doesn't really mean that he did anything to you or against you. We call that a narcissistic injury. In what way were you narcissistically injured? Now, there are ways to deal with that because this couple have clearly not discussed what is your contract around monogamy, what's considered monogamy. Is masturbation, is pornography considered a betrayal? And if you've not had the conversation and you didn't know and you find out, then you can have that same betrayal. So using that same paradigm that not everything your partner does is done in order to hurt you. Yes, in fact, it did hurt you, and it's extremely important that the person who had the affair acknowledges and understands and really has sincere regret and empathy and compassion for the hurt partner. But that might not have been the salient driver of the affair. And so whether it's the man or whether it's the woman, there are many possibilities for repair.
In that case, I want to ask you, because I'm a bit confused. Why is it, if the affair, whatever it's defined as, is not a direct product of a problem in the marriage, how is it that in the course of therapy afterwards, helping to repair this can make things, so to speak, better. In other words, the problem wasn't inherent in the marriage in the first place. So isn't the goal now to get back to where they were? Because there never was a problem to start with based on the marriage per se.
Well, like I said, it's not binary. It's not that there were no problems in the marriage, but there was a part of the person who had the affair that he was bringing to somebody else. He wasn't bringing to his wife, or she wasn't bringing it to her husband. So it does obviously have something to do with the marriage, in that the marriage took up less space than it could have. There's more potential for a deeper relationship were he able to bring those parts to his wife. And often, even though the couple were living very well together and would not have necessarily identified marital problems that would have brought them to therapy, understanding these parts of your partner that they chose to experience elsewhere can absolutely deepen the marriage, because now the partner who had the affair can bring a more integrated self. He doesn't have to just be part person in the marriage. He or she can bring their whole identity, their whole person, all their parts into the marriage. Did that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. The idea that it's not a binary reason obviously rings true in the sense that people have many, many motivations for doing a single action. I think it's important to acknowledge that the problem that you said at the very beginning, which is that some of this directly contradicts what this rabbi, for example, told this husband to do. In other words, the last thing you should do is acknowledge. Because if you acknowledge, you can't stay together.
Exactly. So you're the rabbi. What do you have to say about that?
Well, all I can say about this is, I'll say two things. Thing number one is that, sometimes halacha and therapy seem to contradict. I'm not sure there's an easy solution, and people will deal with it however they deal with it. But my second answer is a bit more hopeful, I think, which is that a person should look at the sources, speak to a halachic authority, a yoetz halacha, a rabbi, whoever it might be, should the situation arise, because this rabbi's narrow, perhaps correct, but narrow reading that make sure you don't acknowledge it is only one way a person can stay with his wife in this case. There could be other ways where the husband could also be allowed, as I mentioned a few moments ago, such as using the idea of tosfot, various other solutions that might be out there. So one should simply have a deeper knowledge of the issue rather than assuming that he simply has to ignore it and deal with all the attendant problems that will cause.
Right, and even just ignoring it because the rabbi told you to ignore it isn't really going to therapeutically be helpful, because it happened, and the feelings of betrayal, of trust are going to be there. And if you don't process them, if you don't deal with them, if you don't communicate about them, then they're just going to be sitting there all the time. And that's going to perpetuate a hostile and angry marital dynamic.
And that leads us to something which you mentioned, which is that there's more than simply sexual intercourse as a form of infidelity. There are other forms which halachically don't have an impact on the marriage, in the sense that halachically they're perfectly allowed to be together should a woman or husband have emotional intimacy with another person, or even physical intimacy that stops short of sexual intimacy. What would be included in this larger category of other forms of affairs that people have to take responsibility for that fall short or stop short of sexual intercourse?
Well, I think that people have to take responsibility for whatever type of infidelity occurred. And there are a lot of things that we can learn from that. Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the idea of monogamy. I think that what happens is that what happens in the world at large trickles down into our very closed religious structure. And as we know, affairs happen. They happen in modern Orthodox and also not so modern Orthodox communities. So we need to talk about that, and not only so much what to do if it happens, but also how to prevent it. Because this is a podcast for people to have better sexual lives, better marital lives. And I think that being aware that nobody's really immune. We all kind of live out there in the world. And what we are learning from the secular academics in this field is that monogamy is really hard, but we're not living in the secular world. In the secular world, there are terms like monogamish, sort of monogamous, or so we don't have that. We have very strong values, and even if monogamy is hard, we're committed to living by those values.
And before we went on the air, you made a very strong point to me, which I think is great, which is that monogamy is not simply a halachic category, it's also a hashkafic, a philosophical category. Very strongly throughout Tanakh, throughout the Bible, are discussions of God's relationship with Israel as being a monogamous relationship and Israel's failure to be monogamous with God. And that idea means that it's not just a pure halachic category or even a pure ethical moral category. It's a truly religious category, a way of viewing the entire world, that you have a commitment, you have a covenant. Your relationship with God, or in this sense, a relationship between a spouse, is a covenant, and it requires a level of commitment. And as you said earlier, I think it's important to note that a couple has to know what that level of commitment entails. In some couples, it's possible that texting a member of the opposite sex might be construed in some ways as a form of infidelity, whereas for another couple, that would be absurd. And I'm curious what you think, if couples should actually discuss this, or it's all implicit.
No, I think nothing is implicit, and everything should be discussed, because what works for some couples, the red lines may be stronger for other couples for different reasons. We do need to be able to keep the lines of communication open, because when does the red flag come up? When you're hiding things, when you're shutting your computer off when your partner walks in the door, when you start to feel like you can't share, that's when you know that, there might be a problem here and we should discuss it. Even being able to go to your partner and say, this guy at work has been kind of sending messages to me and I'm feeling very confused about it. I actually even have some feelings and I'm worried. And
wait, you would talk about that with your partner? That's
absolutely. Well, because what's better?
I would think
better, to talk about it with your partner before it happens or after it already happens?
I'm speaking obviously not as an expert here, just as a layman when it comes to any of these issues, but I would think that acknowledging feelings, even if it's true, would be hurtful in and of itself, as opposed to dealing with it and not giving in to them and not letting your partner know. I'm not suggesting we don't communicate, but communicating something which would be that hurtful, which will be seen as a betrayal, meaning an emotional betrayal, the fact that I could have feelings for this other person and not for my spouse, I would think that would be hurtful in its own right and maybe not a positive thing to discuss.
You know what, Scott? I'm glad that you're responding that way. You're making an excellent point. And I didn't mean to say that when something confusing is going on, we necessarily want to go straight to our spouse, and we certainly don't want to say anything that's going to be hurtful to them. Look, I think that what we really need to talk about is that we want to talk to people about preventing an affair. And in order to do that, we need to talk to somebody to understand how to navigate and to understand what's going on, why we're feeling the way we're feeling. So you're right. In fact, what might be better would be to go speak to a therapist, figure out why you're feeling attracted to somebody else. Try to get help before something happens that you regret. I definitely think that for many cases, just being able to work it out on your own could definitely be beneficial. You may at some point want to share with your spouse, but when you have a better understanding of what those feelings were about, you will be better able to present it to your spouse. I also think we need to talk about why you would want to share with your spouse. Are you trying to confess feelings of guilt just so that you can kind of dump them from you to your spouse? Or is it that you want to deepen the communication? So in terms of what you were saying about feelings hurting your spouse, look, I think that, you need a lot of sensitivity to be able to bring it up with your partner, but feeling a certain feeling towards somebody, again, this is an exact example of how this was not meant to injure you. In other words, the way that you just reacted, we would call that kind of a narcissistic injury. You are hurt by my feeling. And if you're hurt by my feeling, then you've just basically told me that I shouldn't share anything with you. I now know that I shouldn't bring you my truth. And if I can't bring you my truth, I'm going to be more likely to act out.
I guess I have a hard time with this because I guess perhaps I'm thinking like an idealist over here, but a marriage in its ideal form should be, I don't even notice anybody else. I know they're out there, but my feelings are exclusively for my spouse. And I would think that even acknowledging such feelings can be a form of betrayal.
Well, I think that's part of the contract. In other words, do you feel betrayed by my having an attraction to somebody else? Would you feel betrayed if I shared that with you? Is that something that you would want me to share with you, or would you prefer if I kept that to myself? And yeah, I do think that you have somewhat of an idealized idea of marriage, and having that idealization that we will never be attracted to anybody else can trip people up. I'm thinking of a young woman who's very frum, who got into an affair at work. And part of the reason why that happened is because of that naivete. Like, she was so sure that these things don't happen. And this guy started coming on to her, and she didn't know to pick up the cues. And before long, she was in love with him. And she had an affair with him. And it just kind of like, it swept her off her feet. She didn't know enough to be able to identify the signs. And so part of having self-awareness is, knowing when things are happening to you that you're worried about, and being able to bring it up is like saying, look, I've got a toothache and I would like to take care of it before I have a full-blown cavity. And being able to tell your partner that I have a feeling that we have a problem that's about to happen, or I'm feeling things that I'm confused about. I think that his ability, or if it's her, to be able to hear that, you can get hurt by it. That's okay. That makes sense. That's normal. Jealousy is a very primitive reaction, so we are going to feel activated by it. But then after that first reflexive activation and you get a chance to reflect, you'll probably say, you know what, I'm really glad that you brought this up and you told me about it. I mean, I'm glad that you felt close enough to me to be able to share it with me. And now let's talk. Now let's figure this out.
What would
let's
the spouse
go to
say?
Therapy.
What would the spouse say? Like, what would be a good response or a helpful response in a case like this beyond just going to therapy? Is it also, how should the spouse respond? Should the other one say, well, I feel these feelings for somebody else?
I think this has come up before in our podcasts. Curiosity, that's how we develop intimacy, and that's how we strengthen intimacy, is by asking questions that let us know more about the parts of our spouse and their feelings and their deeper feelings. The more curious we are, the more we're developing that intimacy. So kind of being able to disenmesh or put aside what it does to me and what it means about me, and I'm not good enough, and maybe maybe I'm just not good enough in bed, or I'm not pretty enough, or I'm, all of these thoughts that go through your mind, being able to put, to the side and just look at your partner and say, what is it for you? How does this person make you feel? Or what is it that you feel when you're with this person? Not so much to ask questions to kind of like, where did you go? What did you do? What kind of conversations do you have? Let me see your emails. Not so much the questions that are detective questions, but the questions that will allow you to understand more about what's going on with your partner. And yeah, it will activate you, but it'll activate you to heal. It'll activate you towards tikkun, towards fixing what might be going on.
So Talli, we're running out of time, but I want to get back to this idea you mentioned earlier of defining monogamy and determining what monogamy is. How does a couple decide that? What should they do aside from simple communication? What parameters are made for them? And I also want to ask you, how does a couple, in working these issues out, prevent in advance, not only talking about once it's already happened, but how do you work to prevent an affair, however that's defined, from taking place in the first place?
Okay, so you're asking some interesting questions, and they're good questions because, in our previous episodes, we also have encouraged talking about things. We talked about our very first episode, masturbation, and we talked about being shomer negia and how couples may not be shomer before marriage, but never talk about it. Couples go into marriage, and this is one of the things that they don't talk about. And so, first of all, opening up the conversation as to what do you consider monogamy? We live in a modern world. We might have had some friends. Does it mean that we unfriend all our ex-boyfriends on Facebook? Does it mean that we can't get together for lunch with an old high school friend? We're more of a mixed society than more Haredi societies. And by the way, it happens there as well. But I guess the question is, well, what do you consider? Every couple needs to work for themselves what they are comfortable with and to talk about it. And like I said, that's the contract, and that contract can be changed over time. Things like masturbation, is that like having an affair? The other thing that I want to say about affairs, and I've seen different types, there are situations where you're married to somebody with compulsive acting out behavior that you didn't know about, that maybe started with pornography, but also included or includes later on even seeing prostitutes. That is a different kind of therapeutic process because it also really requires understanding what's going on for the person who is acting out in this way.
I'm sorry, Talli, what do you mean by compulsive acting out per se? What does that exactly? It means to try and rebel against whoever's in charge of him at that moment?
No, I guess, you could call it a sexual addiction, or you could call it a splitting in their parts of themselves where they're acting out of a part of them, but they're not really taking responsibility for that part. When they're doing it, they're very ashamed of that part, and they're so overwhelmed with shame that they act out and do it. But afterwards, it hits them with a great deal of anxiety and grief because while they were in it, they weren't really acting from their highest self, their highest moral conscious place.
A bit of a split personality where they say, that's not really me.
In a sense, it's not really me, or it is me, but I hate that about me. And so that's kind of a different type of therapeutic process than would occur if somebody really had an emotional affair or even a physical affair with a strong emotional component, because that's really bringing so many parts of yourself to another person rather than, a person who you don't really care about having a relationship with. You just are, it's an object relation. It's just that person, you gratified yourself through that person, whether it's pornography or whether it's with a prostitute. And that's a different type of relationship. So all of these things will fall under the broad category of non-monogamy, obviously. And so we need to figure out every couple what works or doesn't work for them.
Well, how do they decide in advance, or how do they prepare in advance themselves to make sure that whatever is defined as non-monogamous won't happen?
Look, people don't get married thinking that they're going to have affairs. So people don't have this conversation so much because they don't believe it's going to happen. They don't believe they're going to do it. They don't believe their partner's going to do it. And then life happens. And, you can't always prepare for the type of things that can lead to acting out of the marriage. The fact is that it's a pretty human type of behavior. And sometimes as a human being, you make a mistake and you just did something you shouldn't have done. You were curious, you were lonely, you were grieving, and you have to be able to hold on to what you did and understand it, as well as realize to what extent your partner has been hurt. Esther Perel, who is also a sex therapist, she's very well known, and she's written a book about affairs, and her approach has very much informed me in my therapy. She talks about also processing the affair loss. In other words, the person who has had an affair now has to stop their affair. It was found out. And I actually worked with a couple who he had an affair, and they went to a therapist for maybe 6 times. She made him stop the affair, and there was no processing for him. He just had to end it. He ended it with no closure. And, they got over the crisis and they ended the therapy. That's not sufficient. He also has to be able to understand the meaning of the affair for him and to get closure, because it's a relationship. It's a real thing. I know you're shaking your head.
I'm not shaking my head. I'm just thinking from a different perspective. Perhaps it's my rabbinic training. I'm thinking from a purely moral perspective. This guy did something wrong, so just get out of it as fast as you can. And closure is something which is a luxury you don't have. You just got to close that door and get away from there.
Right.
I understand. I understand what you mean.
That's the difference between being moral and, being therapeutic. People do that, though. That's the conversation they have with themselves. You don't deserve it. You're bad. This is a bad part of you. And they try very hard for the next few years to sit on that bad part of them and not let it jump out. But that doesn't work. That same guy, why they came to me was because he had a second affair. So.
Okay, it's tragic, but I guess I hear what you're saying. It's interesting. I'm going to have to process this. It's going to take a little while, but you're saying some very, very interesting things I've frankly never thought about in this way before.
Well, I guess, we need to acknowledge that these things do happen. And, we certainly don't want to normalize them, but we want to be aware of them so that we can work in an active way on preventing it from happening. Because monogamy really is hard. And there are opportunities for everybody. And sometimes it just feels so easy to be able to experience something so different, so novel, so exciting. And this is the answer to the second part of your question is, how do you affair-proof your marriage? Well, make sure to keep it interesting and novel and exciting, and act out those parts of you in your marriage, and make sure that you keep those lines of communication open. Not 100%. Look, everybody's got to be able to have their own privacy. You know, we talk about secrecy versus privacy, and certainly your fantasies are yours and you can choose to share them, and you don't have to share them, and you don't want to have 100% transparency all the time, because that won't be very exciting either. But when it comes to a real, I'll use the word danger, a risk of acting out of your marriage, the ability to go to your partner and say, look, I think that we need to talk because I feel like there's a danger about to happen, can really save the marriage. I think too, Scott, that the message for our listeners is that there's a lot of shame in this, and this isn't something that we talk about. And when it gets out into the world, a lot of people are saying a lot of lashon hara and talking a lot about, did you hear about this? And I think that you need to know that you're not alone. And yes, people do judge. That's part of society. But that what's most important is not what people are saying. What's most important is your marriage. And to get help, go to therapy. Obviously speak to a rabbinic figure if that's part of what you need. Not everybody chooses to do that. But that's just a message that I wanted to throw out there.
And I want to make sure that that listener who inevitably is going to write and say that we are sanctioning having affairs, I think, Talli, you'll agree, we are not saying that.
Absolutely not.
So just to make sure that one listener who inevitably is going to write in and complain about that particular
point.
We
are only acknowledging that they exist, and if we don't acknowledge them, then we are in denial, and they're just going to happen, and people won't know where to go or how to heal it or what to do about it.
Well, thank you, Talli. This has been really an important lesson for me, very enlightening. I learned a lot, and we thank all of our listeners for coming back to Intimate Judaism. Please continue to share this podcast. Please visit our website, intimatejudaism.com. Once again, you'll find show notes there with some of the sources I mentioned in full. And please continue to send us your questions to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.